All the pieces matter. Jason stared at the whiteboard at the front of the classroom, trying to make sense of what he saw there. Mr. Freeman had drawn a complicated diagram of all the creatures living in the nearby Hotep Wildlife Reserve. Every type of living thing, from trees and insects to mammals and birds, were written down and circled on the board. Arrows snaked around the board, connecting the circles, showing which creatures depended on other creatures to survive. Though he had been hiking out in the Hotep plenty of times, Jason had never given much thought to the animals and other wildlife he had seen out there. He never thought about how the amount of rainfall affected the amount of moisture in the soil, which affected how well plants could grow, which affected the ability of animals that ate those plants to survive. It was enough to make his head swim a little. Jason wasn't the only one who was confused. Mr. Freeman could tell that his students were all struggling to make sense of the mess of connections drawn out on the board. He smiled and stopped drawing for a moment to speak to the class. "Take a deep breath," Mr. Freeman said. "You don't need to memorize what's on the board. If you're going to take away one thing from this lesson, let it be all pieces matter. Every ecosystem on Earth depends on a delicate balance among all the different forms of life within it." Adriana raised her hand and asked why that was. "Well," Mr. Freeman said, "in any ecosystem, all the creatures within it are competing for the same resources: food, water, shelter, the basic needs of every living thing. There's only so much to go around, so creatures have to compete with other creatures to get what they need. And since they all go about it in a unique way, all the creatures in an ecosystem end up depending on one another. Let me give you an example. Remember that video we watched last week with the wolves killing the elk at Yellowstone National Park?" Everyone nodded. "How many of you thought that the wolves were mean for killing those elk?" About half the students raised their hand, but Jason kept his hand down. "Wild animals will do what they do," he thought. "The idea of meanness never enters into it. They act on instinct." "Consider this then," Mr. Freeman continued. "Without the wolves in the park to keep the elk population in check, the elk would have eaten all the aspen and willow in the park. Not only would those plants be gone, but the other animals that depend on them to survive would have been out of luck too. All the pieces matter." After class that day, Jason went home and looked up ecosystem resilience on the internet. He found a lot of interesting links about different ecosystems that have changed rapidly because one of the pieces had been taken out of the puzzle. As Mr. Freeman would have put it, in Africa, people hunted lions and leopards and reduced their population, leading to a higher population of a certain type of baboon. That had led somehow to higher rates of parasites in baboons and people. And along some coasts, human activity had reduced the sea otter population. The sea otters ate sea urchins that ate kelp from the massive kelp forest. Without the sea otters to keep them in check, the kelp started to disappear. The whole idea was starting to make sense to Jason. It was basically like dominoes. All the pieces lined up, and if you knocked one down, it would knock the next one, which would knock down the one after that until they all went down. Of course, it was a lot more complicated than that, but that was the basic idea. The next time Jason went to Hotep Wildlife Reserve on a camping trip with his dad, he made a point of observing the wildlife. He spent 20 minutes watching a copperhead snake slither across the forest floor, wondering about its role in the larger system. Through his binoculars, he watched a robin build its nest near the top of an oak tree. He imagined the robin catching insects to bring back to the nest to feed her chicks. He thought about how